Previously, we discussed 2D textures and how to adjust their tiling. You can adjust the tiling by going to the 2D placement node connected to the texture and adjusting the attributes. Now, what that node is doing is it's relating the UV texture space of the surface to the pixels of the texture. UV texture space is carried by the surface, and it's a coordinate system that relates, once again, pixels of the texture to points on the surface. Now, some surfaces have a valid UV texture space, some have no UV texture space, and some have UV texture space that needs to be adjusted. The UV texture space is not correctly adjusted or prepared. What you'll have is a texture that is streaked or smeared or is illegible on the surface. Now, with a primitive, it doesn't really matter. If you create NURBS primitive or a polygon primitive, they're given a valid UV texture space to start with. So in other words, you can texture them right away with a complex texture map, render it out, and that map will look legible. The most you have to do is adjust the tiling, which is more aesthetic. However, if you build a surface from scratch, you may need to adjust that UV texture space. Now, fortunately, with a NURBS surface, like I have here on the left, the UV texture space is always valid, whether you make a primitive or whether you make a custom surface. For instance, if you loft the surface, you get a UV texture space for free, and therefore you can render out a complex texture right away. And that's because the NURBS surfaces are based on NURBS curves, and the curves carry the critical UV information. In other words, the UV information is provided to the surface right at the point of creation. Now, polygon surfaces like I have on the right are not so fortunate. Again, if you start with the primitive, you'll have a valid UV texture space. However, as soon as you apply additional modeling tools like extrude or add divisions or smooth, the UV texture space may become illegible. You may need to adjust it. Until you do that, the texture may appear illegible. There are a whole set of tools to project new UVs onto a polygon primitive or to adjust them. We'll talk more about those later on. Just keep in mind, if you create a polygon custom surface, even if you start with a primitive, at some point you'll probably need to deal with the UVs so you can properly texture. For example, some of the models demonstrated earlier, such as a banana or a chair, even though they're simple, need to have their UVs adjusted. Now, there's a quick way to look at the UV texture space, and we'll do that in this video. If you select a surface, like this primitive plane here on the right, and go up to Window, UV Texture Editor, this editor is designed to examine UVs and to edit them. Now, when I say UVs, UVs are just shorthand for UV points. And UV points are points that relate the UV texture space to the bitmap pixels, or the procedural texture pixels. So if you open up this UV Texture Editor, here's a separate window. And if the object is selected or surface is selected, you'll see it in this view. Now, we're going to talk about how to use this in more detail, but just for now, you can see that the edges of the surface also appear in the UV Texture Editor. So the surface is laid out in the UV Texture Editor. Now, this dark gray area is the valid UV texture space. Anything outside the dark gray area is not a valid space and will receive a repeated part of the map, whether you want it to repeat or not. In other words, if one of these faces lies outside this dark area, you don't have any control. This gets a repeated part of the texture. So ideally, your surface sits within this dark gray area. Again, you see the edges here. Those relate to the edges of your actual surface in the view panel, as is these individual faces. But we'll return to this in more detail later and discuss how to use this window and how to edit the UVs in this. Now, if I pick the NURBS surface, I'll smooth this window over and pick this NURBS primitive, you're not going to see anything obvious. Now, the surface will be displayed in here, but it'll be dark gray lines. It'll be a little bit hard to see past the grid. That's because you cannot manipulate NURBS UV points in this editor. NURBS are born with UV points. They work right off the bat, however, you cannot adjust them. If you want to adjust them, you can only do so indirectly by changing the UV tiling to the 2D placement node, or using a 3D procedural texture where you get the placement box which you can move. You cannot directly affect the UV points inside this editor. So really, this is mainly designed for dealing with polygon surfaces.